Okay, so today I'm actually making a bit of a departure from normal practice in that I've actually got another screen here that I'm reading from. So if I seem a little bit formal, that's why why it is. You're with Peter Cleve, and I'm looking at a paper being developed on how mining companies ought to get along or interact, probably a better word, with locals, with Indigenous people particularly. And it seems to have got a bit of attention out there. I started with 10 points and now I'm up to 12. But basically they're quite commonsensical, I suppose. But it follows a talk that was given by myself, Maurice Takarangi, and others in Wellington last week. So it's not exactly what we were talking about in Wellington, but it's along the same lines. And if we look at Indigenous groups around the world and resource exploration on land and sea, I've put together a set of points that companies involved in exploration in or near the territories of Indigenous people need to be aware of, and to take advice from locals on how this all works. So, for example, if we look at my first point, it's titled Cultural Safety. Most companies have good physical safety provisions. Some have good safety provisions for marine animals and fish near deep-sea drilling sites, while others have good regard for the safety of land animals and birds. There is a need now to talk about cultural safety and to take advice from locals on any cultural matters that might be affected by the presence of mining companies. These might range from the presence of drugs or alcohol in a mining operation to the kind of socialization between mining crews and locals considered desirable by both the companies and the local people. It can be at that kind of interactive level, or it can apply to any of these other points that I've listed, and there's a fair number of points through which cultural considerations are really important. Okay, my point 2 is that the exploration company needs to understand local practices and theories of ecology and to know what the locals consider desirable in their ecology. So it's all very well taking a Western ecological worldview or system into an Indigenous situation. It's altogether another thing for the mining companies to understand what was there before, how did things work there in the past, and what were the forms of explanation there. Because sooner or later these two forms of explanation of how the natural world works are going to come into contact. And it's critical that people understand one another here. So benefits to the community. The company needs to understand how the local community might be augmented or improved by its presence. Sometimes work is offered to locals at the outset, and this may be a mistake, I believe, as when jobs do not materialise. In some cases, the best option might be to think laterally outside the frame of the exploration activity to help the local community realise a dream or a plan that they might have. Planting trees by a steel company turning over sand to find iron. That's an example that I'm familiar with that example. I'm not going to name the company and so forth, but yeah, I'm familiar with that. I saw that happening with a steel company at the outset had no expertise with trees, but they had to develop that to help the locals and bringing in other talent as well, I suppose. And this meant that at the finish of mining, there was something left for the people. But there's all sorts of other lateral forms of consideration that can occur, and it's important that these are explored. Now, it's also important to take time with explanations of science. Now, the locals must not be blinded by science. Matters must be explained in ways that they understand and they may contribute to if they so desire. Now, sometimes that means understanding traditional methods, as when exploration affects a fishery. Here, the company needs to understand how traditional fishing worked in the first place, and to show how the science being brought into the community affects the law and traditional science of the community involved. And this is really very, very important, because there's nothing more debilitating, really, than people faced with actions that that don't have an understanding. And just moving on to point 5, introduced technology needs to be carefully considered before being used. If computers and the internet are required to analyse the data from exploration, the question needs to be asked whether the locals have access to and control of and understanding of the IT involved. If not, how can the company help to make sure that the way the locals understand matters is the same as the way the company does, or at least with the same amount of data and techniques of analysis done using up-to-date technology? I mean, that's pretty obvious, so I'm not going to talk much more about that, but there are a lot of examples of that, of new technology coming in, it not being shared, and resentment growing, partly because of that. To consider local training organisations. In New Zealand, there are Māori-owned training organisations, Wānanga and others, and these may be appropriate vehicles for training, say, in diving required and sea exploration. And I think it's good to talk about, as some companies are coming into the country, talking about the development of training programs. Next question is, do locals control those training programs, and what input do locals have, Indigenous people as well, into the way training is structured and conducted? Okay, to provide systems of care is my next point, point 7. In the event of any kind of catastrophe or accident resulting from or associated with the exploration that the company does, there might be an assurance that from the company to locals that their counsellors, tohuna, shamans or the like be employed on a par with other counsellors, because it's no good to bring in foreign counsellors when people already have counsellors that they're perfectly happy with. And it's a point, this particular point I believe is often undersung. Okay, dress codes, number 8. These might be very important in interaction and in the employment of locals. Issues range from hair length to appropriate office wear to the covering of the face. Okay, and I think this is pretty well covered, I think. But it's sometimes forgotten just the same. Language. This is potentially a huge loss as many Indigenous groups are trying to retain their language. Signage, greetings, and many other matters are involved here. So really this is talking about an effort by the company to employ the language of and use the language of the locals as much as the locals want them to, and to be open to how the locals want to interact vis-a-vis their language. Number 10, employment and other interviews. Indigenous groups sometimes have preferred interview arrangements, such as having whānau support for the interviewee in the case of the Māori. Companies may want to adopt some of these to enable a fair process that yields valuable HR information. And obviously that's the purpose of an interview for an employee, is for the employer to get some information about the person concerned. And there's no good talking to a person who's got a kind of wall or a veil mentally or emotionally at an interview. There's got to be a comfort situation, I believe, where the interviewee feels comfortable, feels able to talk and shares information that the company needs, and the company by the same token needs to share information as well. So that is very, very important. It's critical, and I don't think I need to say any more about that because a lot of it's self-evident. Okay, knowledge and attention to sacred places. These include burial sites, meeting places past and present, and other sites. And again, this is usually part of the situation, but again, sometimes forgotten. Okay, the last point that I've got so far is knowledge of and attention to following local performance sequences, as in the order of speeches at farewells, greetings, and other community functions. Now that sounds quite sort of not exactly. It just doesn't sound very important, but it actually is. If you have a function, who actually starts things, who actually finishes things, who speaks first and last, the opening and closing of events with prayers and other attention to ritual is often very, very important to the locals, to the Indigenous people. And it's no good just bringing a kind of Western style meeting situation to the locals, when they much prefer to do things another way. And there are all sorts of symbols of power, symbols of respect, symbols of mana and other things involved. And a meeting is not just being able to tell someone else how something works or that type of thing. So there you go, people. there's a dozen points. I'm up to a dozen points. And thanks for all the feedback on this. And I look forward to more. Actually building a bibliography now and looking at Indigenous Affairs, a journal put out by the International Work Group up to 2010 on Indigenous Affairs. So very, very happy about some of the things that are happening with this little project here. And thanks once again for all who have contributed. You're with Peter Cleave.